Hello, dear viewer. Here at Plough of Twist, we want to make one thing crystal clear: we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. This story you're about to hear is more than just entertainment, it's a reminder of resilience and the strength within every person who has faced injustice. We see you, we support you, and we believe in a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Now, sit back, and get ready for a powerful story of justice and transformation. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an impactful tale. Enjoy the story. A cold night settled over the city streets, where a man, tired and shivering, clung to his last bit of warmth outside the bright, bustling restaurant. He pressed his worn, calloused hands together, barely feeling his fingers as the wind whipped through his thin layers. People passed him by, some glancing quickly before averting their eyes, while others pretended he didn't exist. The warm glow of the restaurant's interior taunted him, each patron's laughter and clinking glass reminding him of how far he was from that life, how close, yet how utterly unreachable. And then, from the crowd, a figure approached. Clad in a police uniform, with a sharp, fixed gaze, the officer walked straight up to the man on the ground, stopping just inches away from him. There was no kindness in his face, no understanding. Just disgust. "What do you think you're doing here?" the officer sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're ruining the place, making people uncomfortable. Move." The man barely managed to open his mouth to respond when a sudden splash of hot liquid struck him across the face. Scalding water, straight from the officer's cup. The man gasped, scrambling back, his face contorting in pain. The officer chuckled, a cold, empty sound that echoed louder than the murmurs of the onlookers, who watched but didn't interfere. No one dared to step forward. They all just watched. "You like that, huh?" the officer sneered again, towering over him. "That's what you deserve for stinking up the place. You people should learn your place." And with that, the officer turned and strutted away, leaving the man on the ground, clutching his face, his spirit as bruised as his skin. The murmurs grew louder, but still, no one helped. The man was left there, humiliated, his hope shattered. He stared into the distance, barely hearing the whispers of pity, of disapproval mixed with apathy. But as he sat there, a flicker of something began to grow within him, a memory, a connection, a thought that brought a faint, desperate glimmer to his eyes. Because what that officer didn't know, what none of those silent onlookers knew, was that this man had a brother. A brother who would hear of this. A brother with power and determination, who had spent his life fighting for justice. A brother who was no stranger to the darkest sides of human nature, nor to the abuse of authority. And this brother wasn't just a man with a badge, he was an agent of the FBI. When the officer clocked out that night, exhausted and unaware, he had no idea that his life had just taken a sharp, dangerous turn. It was a casual act for him, another night where he let out his anger on someone who couldn't fight back, someone who, in his eyes, didn't matter. But soon enough, that officer would find himself staring down a line of consequences he never saw coming, consequences that would creep into every part of his life, exposing him, dismantling him piece by piece. Because this man's brother was coming for him, and there was no hiding from what was about to unfold. It started with questions. Silent ones at first. Glances from his own colleagues, from superiors who usually greeted him with friendly smiles but now seemed guarded, watchful. Then came the closed-door meetings, the unexpected calls to his personal phone, the strange looks from his family who had started to hear rumors. The whispers turned to accusations, accusations that began to pull apart the carefully built image he'd spent years crafting. But it wasn't just his image that was unraveling. Slowly, evidence emerged. Evidence that he never knew existed. Conversations he thought were private, moments he believed were off the record, all of it brought to light by a brother who had the skills, the connections, and the relentless drive to expose every piece of corruption, every hidden prejudice. This wasn't a simple investigation. This was personal, targeted, an attack that cut deeper with every revelation. As the officer's world collapsed around him, he could feel the walls closing in, each revelation a crushing blow, each encounter a reminder of the power he had once wielded over others but was now turned against him. He was no longer in control. He was the hunted. But what exactly would this brother do? How far would he go to seek justice? And when the dust finally settled, would there be anything left of the life this officer thought was untouchable? Brace yourself for a story that cuts to the heart of power, prejudice, and payback, a story that won't just keep you listening but will make you question how far justice can truly go. Can vengeance be served without crossing the line? Or will justice demand a price no one could foresee? Find out, as this tale of power, betrayal, and redemption unfolds with a twist that you'll never see coming. The streetlights flickered, casting a dim glow over the pavement as Isaac pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, seeking whatever warmth he could find in the biting cold. His life had taken a downward turn in ways he hadn't anticipated, spiraling him into a world he barely recognized. Once, he'd had dreams, small ones, maybe, but dreams all the same. He had always worked hard, doing odd jobs and trying to make an honest living, even when life seemed determined to test his limits. But the relentless weight of hardship eventually broke down his resolve. Now, he was left to face the harsh reality of life on the streets, living day to day, meal by meal, constantly fighting the stigma and disdain of those who saw him as little more than an inconvenience. It was ironic, really. Isaac had grown up in a tight-knit family, raised by parents who had instilled in him a sense of responsibility and respect. His brother, Nathan, had been his closest companion. While Isaac's path had been challenging, Nathan had thrived, ultimately finding his calling in law enforcement. Not just any law enforcement either, Nathan had climbed the ranks, his grit and discipline earning him a respected position as an FBI agent. The two brothers, though on different paths, were bonded by their love for one another and a shared sense of justice that their parents had imparted to them. For Nathan, it was this sense of justice that drove him to protect, to serve, to bring order to the chaos. Yet despite their closeness, their lives had drifted apart over the years. Nathan's rigorous schedule left him little time to check in with Isaac. The few times they had spoken, Isaac had brushed off questions about his well-being, determined not to burden his brother with his struggles. Isaac had always felt a sense of pride in Nathan's achievements and didn't want his own difficulties to dampen that. Isaac's journey to homelessness wasn't a result of one single event, but a chain of setbacks. It started with the closing of the factory where he had worked for years, a place he'd thought of as stable. Losing his job had sent him into a spiral of unemployment, mounting bills, and, ultimately, eviction. He had tried everything he could to regain control of his life, working odd jobs, seeking help where he could find it, but nothing seemed to hold. Friends, well-meaning at first, eventually faded away. Over time, he found himself without any resources left, and without a roof over his head. Isaac had fallen through the cracks, and it was only his quiet resilience that kept him going. On this particular night, Isaac found himself outside an upscale restaurant. The restaurant's windows glowed with warmth and life, patrons laughing and chatting over polished tables, oblivious to the world outside. He sat just a few steps from the door, hoping to shield himself from the sharp winter wind that had settled over the city. He wasn't asking for anything, not even food. He just wanted a place to rest for a while, to escape the biting cold that had become a part of his existence. Inside, a different world thrived. People in designer coats and polished shoes moved through the warm glow of the restaurant, servers bustling from table to table, delivering wine and gourmet meals. Isaac could feel the faint warmth of the restaurant's heating even from where he sat, a brief reminder of comforts he no longer had. For a moment, he let himself imagine what it would be like to sit inside, to be seen as someone worthy of such treatment. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He knew better than to entertain dreams that were no longer his reality. As he sat there, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible, he noticed a man walking toward him with a purpose in his step. The man's uniform became clear under the streetlight, and Isaac's stomach sank. It was a police officer. The officer's face was unreadable, but his posture and pace hinted at an aggression Isaac had seen before. Isaac had encountered officers in the past who treated him with indifference or mild annoyance, but something about this man seemed different. This officer was Officer Grant, a man whose own life was layered in complexities he rarely revealed. Grant had been with the force for over a decade, though his career had been marked by instances of excessive force and complaints from citizens. He carried a chip on his shoulder, a bitterness toward anyone he saw as beneath him. His sense of superiority wasn't just a personal flaw, it was something he carried with pride, a belief that he was the one keeping order in a world that, in his mind, was full of chaos. Grant approached Isaac, his eyes scanning him with an air of disdain that Isaac felt in his bones. As the officer stopped in front of him, Isaac looked up, hoping to show respect, to appear as unthreatening as possible. But Officer Grant's gaze didn't soften. He looked at Isaac as if he were a stain on the pristine image of the restaurant. "Get up," Grant commanded, his voice sharp, loud enough to attract the attention of a few nearby patrons. Isaac started to push himself to his feet, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. But before he could fully stand, Grant took a step back and, with a slight smirk, lifted a cup in his hand. Without warning, he threw the contents at Isaac. The hot liquid hit Isaac's face, shocking him, searing his skin. He gasped, recoiling, his hands instinctively moving to shield his face. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion, their eyes wide but their expressions detached. They whispered among themselves, but no one moved to help. "You're making people uncomfortable," Grant sneered, his voice low but venomous. "People like you don't belong here." Isaac staggered back, the heat of the water still stinging his skin. He struggled to find words, to protest, to explain that he hadn't been bothering anyone. But Grant's gaze was unyielding, his authority absolute. Isaac knew there was nothing he could say to change the outcome of this encounter. The onlookers remained silent, their eyes flickering with brief flashes of pity before quickly looking away. Isaac felt the weight of their judgment, their apathy cutting deeper than the sting of the water. In that moment, he felt smaller than ever, reduced to nothing more than a spectacle for people to glance at, a problem for them to ignore. As Grant walked away, his duty, in his eyes, fulfilled, Isaac was left standing in the cold, his dignity shattered. The faint warmth he'd felt from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a chill that settled deep within him. The shame, the humiliation, it was overwhelming. But as he wiped his face, his thoughts drifted to his brother, Nathan. Nathan, who had always stood up for what was right. Nathan, who had always believed in him, even when no one else did. Nathan, who had once told him, "Justice is for everyone, Isaac." Everyone. Isaac didn't have much, but he had one thing left, a connection, a family bond that ran deeper than any humiliation he'd just endured. Nathan would find out about this, he was sure of it. And Isaac knew that Nathan would not rest until he'd done something about it. For Nathan, the world was divided between right and wrong, and he had always stood firmly on the side of justice. He didn't care about appearances, about social status, he cared about people, about making sure no one suffered at the hands of those who abused their power. Isaac knew his brother well enough to know that this would not go ignored. But even he couldn't predict the lengths Nathan would go to in order to make things right. As Isaac stood there in the cold, his spirit bruised but not broken, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The humiliation was raw, the hurt was fresh, but he knew his brother. Nathan would never let this go. Nathan was sitting in his dimly lit office, the hum of the city outside barely reaching him. Stacks of reports lined his desk, evidence of his relentless pursuit of justice in his role as an FBI agent. He had worked long and hard to get where he was, to build a career that meant something. Yet, in that moment, none of the accolades or achievements seemed to matter. His mind kept drifting back to Isaac, his brother whom he hadn't spoken to in months, his brother whom he worried about daily but had heard so little from lately. Then, his phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He reached for it, checking the caller ID, an unknown number. He answered cautiously, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Nathan, Isaac's voice was barely a whisper, strained and tired. Isaac. Nathan straightened in his seat, his heart tightening with a rush of relief mixed with worry. Where are you? Are you okay? There was a long silence on the other end, then a shaky breath. I didn't want to call, didn't want to bother you. But I didn't know who else to talk to. Nathan could hear the exhaustion, the defeat in Isaac's voice. Isaac, you're my brother. Don't ever think you're bothering me. Just tell me what's going on. Isaac hesitated, and Nathan could sense him gathering his thoughts, piecing together words for something he didn't want to say out loud. It's the police. One of them. Last night, he threw hot water at me, Nathan. He just threw it, like I was trash. The words hung in the air, sinking deep into Nathan's core. His jaw tightened, and he felt a rush of anger he rarely experienced. Isaac, he said, his voice thick with restrained fury, what exactly happened? Isaac began to recount the story, every word weighed with shame and frustration, as if it hurt to relive the humiliation he'd endured. Nathan listened in silence, his fists clenched, heart pounding, each detail only fueling the fire within him. By the time Isaac finished, Nathan could feel the familiar urge for justice rising within him, only this time, it was personal. Did you get his name? Anything that could identify him? Nathan's voice was cold, all traces of brotherly warmth replaced by a chilling determination. Isaac's voice dropped to a murmur. Grant. Officer Grant. That's what his badge said. He hesitated, then added, I don't want to make things worse, Nathan. I just needed to tell someone. Needed someone to understand. Nathan took a deep breath, his mind racing, formulating a plan even as he spoke. You did the right thing, Isaac. You did the right thing calling me. You don't have to worry about a thing. I'll handle it. Isaac let out a shaky breath. I don't want any trouble for you. I know your job is important. Isaac, Nathan said, his tone firm but reassuring, this isn't about my job. This is about right and wrong. And that officer, he's on the wrong side of both. After hanging up, Nathan sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what he had just learned. It wasn't unusual for him to hear stories of abuse, of people misusing power, but this was different. It was his own flesh and blood, his brother, who had been humiliated, treated like he was less than human. His mind flashed back to their childhood, to moments when he protected Isaac from bullies or stood up for him when others looked down on him. This time, however, it was more than just a scuffle on the playground. This was a man with authority who had decided that Isaac's dignity was worthless. And that, Nathan could not stand. The next day, Nathan began his quiet but methodical investigation. He was meticulous, gathering background information, scouring databases, searching for anything that could give him insight into Officer Grant's record. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern of complaints against Grant, accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of authority. The complaints, though numerous, were often brushed aside, buried in paperwork or dismissed by superiors. Nathan had seen this pattern before, and it disgusted him. As the pieces started to come together, Nathan knew he had to tread carefully. He wasn't just up against one officer, he was facing an entire system that had allowed men like Grant to operate unchecked. But he was determined, and with his skills and connections, he knew he could get what he needed, enough to hold Grant accountable. A week passed, and Nathan's quiet investigation was yielding results. He had managed to gather testimonies from people who had encountered Grant before, each account reinforcing the picture of a man who saw himself as above the law. With every story he uncovered, Nathan's resolve strengthened. One evening, he met Isaac at a small, unassuming diner. Isaac looked worn, the events of the previous week etched into his face. Nathan's heart ached at the sight, but he maintained his calm, professional demeanor, knowing that his brother needed to see strength, not pity. "Isaac," he began, sitting across from him, "I've been looking into things. Grant, he's got a history, a long one. You're not the first person he's done this to." Isaac looked down, a hint of shame in his eyes. "So he's just been getting away with it?" "Not anymore." Nathan's voice was firm, filled with the determination of a man on a mission. "I have enough to make a case. But it's going to take time, and I'll need your help." Isaac nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "What do you need me to do?" "We're going to document everything, every detail. You'll have to be honest about what happened, even if it's hard. And if there's anything else, other encounters, other officers involved, I need to know. This is going to be thorough. We're not just going after one bad cop, we're going to expose the system that protects him." Isaac nodded, a small spark of hope igniting in his eyes. "I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes." They spent hours that night, going over every detail, each memory painful but necessary. Nathan could see the strain on his brother's face, the toll it took to relive the humiliation, but he also saw a determination he hadn't seen in Isaac for a long time. Isaac was ready for justice, and Nathan was more than willing to make sure he got it. As the investigation deepened, Nathan began to sense a shift. His inquiries were met with more resistance, calls he made to internal departments went unanswered, requests for information were delayed without explanation. It was clear that someone was protecting Grant, someone who had a vested interest in keeping his record clean. Nathan felt the walls closing in around him, the weight of bureaucracy pressing down, but he was undeterred. Every obstacle only fueled his determination. One evening, Nathan confronted one of Grant's supervisors under the pretense of a casual conversation. They exchanged small talk before Nathan's tone shifted, his questions pointed, his intent clear. The supervisor squirmed, deflecting questions, avoiding eye contact. It was a brief exchange, but Nathan saw enough. This man knew more than he was letting on, and Nathan intended to find out exactly what it was. As Nathan left, the supervisor called after him, a forced casualness in his voice. "You know, sometimes it's best to let things go, Nathan. Not everything needs to be a crusade." Nathan turned, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not. But when someone takes advantage of their power to hurt others, it's not something I can ignore. You do well to remember that." The warning was subtle, but it hung in the air, a reminder that Nathan wasn't backing down. As he walked away, he felt a surge of anticipation. He was getting closer, and with each step, he felt the tension building. He could feel it, a reckoning was coming, and there was nothing that could stop it. When Nathan met with Isaac again, he could see the fear and hope mingling in his brother's eyes. They were both aware that they were challenging something far larger than one man. They were challenging a system, a deeply rooted belief that some lives mattered more than others. Isaac had lived his life under that weight, but for the first time, he was seeing a way out, a chance to stand up, to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from him. Nathan leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "This isn't over, Isaac. Not by a long shot. Grant's protected, but he's not untouchable. We're going to make sure everyone sees him for who he really is." Isaac nodded, a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. "Do you really think we can do it?" Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "I know we can. And when this is over, he'll wish he'd never laid a hand on you." The anticipation between them was palpable, the tension building with each passing day. Nathan's investigation was closing in, and Isaac could feel the weight lifting, just slightly, as the possibility of justice became real. But as the walls started to close in on Grant, they both knew they were approaching a breaking point, a moment where everything would come to light, where justice would finally confront the man who had abused his power. They both could feel it, the storm was coming, and it was going to change everything. The office was nearly silent except for the ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching into the next as if time itself were holding its breath. Nathan sat alone at his desk, reviewing the last few pieces of evidence he'd meticulously gathered. He had everything he needed to confront Officer Grant, all the statements, the records of past complaints, even a few reluctant testimonies from fellow officers who finally cracked under Nathan's unrelenting questioning. Each piece fit together like a mosaic of abuse, years of unchecked power and cruelty that Grant had wielded without fear of consequence. And now, all of it was about to unravel. Tonight, he would bring Isaac with him. It was a risk, one Nathan hadn't taken lightly, but he knew his brother deserved to witness this moment. Isaac had suffered the brunt of Grant's abuse, his dignity stripped away in an act of public cruelty. Nathan wanted him to see that justice could be served, that he wasn't invisible, that his pain had weight. He wanted Isaac to stand in front of the man who had humiliated him and see that the tables had turned. As they approached the precinct, Isaac walked beside him in silence. The weight of the past few weeks was evident in every step he took, but there was something else now, an undercurrent of strength. Nathan noticed his brother's squared shoulders, the determination etched into his expression. Isaac was no longer the man who had stumbled out of the cold, broken and humiliated. He was someone who had fought his way back, someone who was ready to face his tormentor. They entered the precinct, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the polished floors. The usual bustling energy was subdued tonight, it was late, and only a few officers remained, glancing up briefly as Nathan and Isaac walked by. When they reached Grant's desk, the officer was seated, his attention on a report in front of him. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation as he recognized Isaac. "What's this?" Grant's voice was laced with contempt as he straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Thought you knew better than to come back around here, especially with him," he said, jerking his head in Nathan's direction. Nathan's expression was calm but unyielding, his gaze steady as he addressed Grant. "We need to talk, Officer Grant." "Officially." Grant scoffed, his gaze flicking dismissively between the two brothers. "Is that right? And you thought you'd just waltz in here and, you've got a lot to answer for, Grant," Nathan cut in, his voice steely. "And I'm not here to let you brush this off. Not this time." Grant's smirk faded slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "I don't know what you think you're trying to pull, but I don't have to answer to you," he sneered, his voice low but sharp. "This little charity case of yours?" He nodded toward Isaac, his expression one of pure disdain. "He's got nothing on me." Isaac took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with an edge that hadn't been there before. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, meeting Grant's gaze unflinchingly. "You think people like me don't matter? That you can do whatever you want and no one will stop you?" Grant's face twisted with irritation, but Nathan held up a hand, signaling Isaac to let him handle it. Nathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of papers, letting them fall onto Grant's desk with a heavy slap. "These are formal complaints," he began, his voice even, controlled. "Reports from people who, until now, didn't have anyone willing to listen. People who've suffered because of you, because of the authority you've abused." Grant's jaw clenched, but he forced a smirk, dismissing the papers with a wave of his hand. "Complaints mean nothing, especially from people like him," he said, gesturing toward Isaac with a sneer. "People like him?" Nathan repeated, his voice a quiet challenge. "You mean people who don't fit into your view of what's acceptable? People who you think you can treat like garbage because no one's watching?" Grant shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. "People like him are nuisances. They make the streets look filthy, scare away decent folks. I'm just doing my job, keeping things clean." Isaac's fists clenched at his sides, but he held himself back, his breathing steady. Nathan placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance before turning his gaze back to Grant. "Keeping things clean," he said, his tone icy. "That's what you call throwing scalding water on a man who's just trying to find a little warmth? That's what you call abuse, Grant? And now, you're finally going to answer for it." Grant's smug expression faltered, a hint of fear creeping into his eyes. He glanced around, as if expecting someone to step in, to back him up. But no one moved. The few officers who were present watched from a distance, their faces expressionless, offering no support, no sign that they would come to his aid. Nathan pressed on, his voice unwavering. "I've been to your superiors, Grant. I've shown them these complaints. They can't ignore it any longer. You've built a career on fear, on intimidation, but that ends tonight." Grant's hands gripped the edge of his desk, his face paling slightly. "You think you can walk in here and ruin me with a few pieces of paper," he spat, desperation edging into his voice. "You're nothing but an FBI agent with a chip on his shoulder, and your brother, he's nothing. Just a piece of trash that I should have gotten rid of a long time ago." The room went silent, the weight of his words hanging thickly in the air. Isaac stared at Grant, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes, but Nathan's expression remained unchanged, a hardened resolve etched into his face. "You're right about one thing," Nathan said, his voice dangerously soft. "I am an FBI agent. And that means I know exactly how to make sure justice is served, even if it takes everything I have. Because unlike you, I believe in what I do. I believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, with dignity. And tonight, Officer Grant, you're going to see what happens when you push the people you think are powerless too far." Grant's defiance faltered, a flash of genuine fear in his eyes as he glanced around once more, realizing he was alone. The bravado drained from his face, replaced by a defensive sneer. "You won't get away with this," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Nathan stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You're already finished, Grant. The people you've hurt, the lives you've damaged, they're all here, represented in those papers, and they're finally going to see justice. You're going to be held accountable, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Grant opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the precinct's chief entered the room, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a somber expression. He looked at Nathan, then at Grant, and gave a slight nod. "It's done, Grant," the chief said quietly. "Your badge, your gun. You're suspended pending an investigation, and frankly, I don't see you coming back from this." Grant's face turned a shade paler as he stared at the chief, the reality of his situation finally setting in. "Chief, you can't do this, you know what I do here, how I keep things under control. This is a mistake." The chief shook his head, his gaze firm but weary. "No, Grant. The mistake was thinking you were above the law. And the reports, they're damning. You've crossed a line that no officer should ever cross. You've humiliated, abused, and hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. People like Isaac, who deserve respect, not cruelty." Grant's expression contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "This is a witch hunt," he yelled, his voice echoing through the quiet precinct. "These people are liars, lowlifes who don't understand what it means to keep a city safe." Isaac's voice was quiet, but steady, cutting through the noise with unexpected strength. "We know what it means to be safe. We know what it means to be respected, to be treated like human beings. Something you never cared to understand." Grant's gaze locked on Isaac, his face twisting with resentment, but for the first time, he said nothing. There was no one left to back him, no wall to hide behind. In that moment, stripped of his power, he was just another man forced to face the weight of his own actions. Nathan took a breath, feeling the tension ease slightly as the chief motioned to two officers, who moved forward to escort Grant away. The once arrogant officer now looked smaller, defeated, his shoulders slumped as he realized the true cost of his cruelty. The room was silent as he was led out, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, fading into the distance. Isaac and Nathan stood side by side, watching until Grant was out of sight. Isaac released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders relaxing, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in what felt like ages. Nathan turned to him, his voice soft. "It's over, Isaac. You don't have to carry this anymore. Isaac nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For standing up for me, for believing in me." Nathan put a hand on his brother's shoulder, his expression warm. "You never had to face this alone. Justice isn't just about the law, Isaac. It's about standing up for each other, making sure no one is left to suffer in silence." They left the precinct together, stepping out into the quiet night, the cold air carrying a sense of finality, a promise of healing and hope. As they walked, side by side, Nathan knew that they'd both been changed by this experience, that the bond between them had only strengthened through the trials they'd faced. And as the first light of dawn broke over the city, they continued forward, the darkness behind them, ready to rebuild and look toward a future where they were no longer defined by fear or pain, but by resilience, by family, and by a justice that could never be silenced. As Nathan and Isaac walked out of the precinct, the cool night air hit them, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had built inside. For a moment, they stood in silence, letting the enormity of what had just happened sink in. The weight of the confrontation, the years of abuse, and the final, undeniable justice, it all seemed to hang in the air, as if even the city itself was pausing to acknowledge the shift. But Isaac's face wasn't entirely relaxed. Instead, he seemed lost, distant, as if processing the realization that Grant was finally gone from his life wasn't as simple as it seemed. Nathan noticed the hesitation, the lingering sadness in his brother's eyes. "Isaac," he said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry that anymore. You did it. We did it. You're free from him, from that shadow." Isaac looked down, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he shifted on his feet. "It's just, strange," he murmured, almost to himself. "For so long, I thought that people like him were untouchable, that no one would ever listen to someone like me." Nathan's grip on Isaac's shoulder tightened, his gaze steady. "They listened, Isaac. Because you had every right to be heard. No one has the right to silence you. Not him, not anyone." Isaac glanced up at Nathan, a hint of disbelief in his eyes. "How did you know?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know it would actually work?" Nathan took a deep breath, considering his response. "I didn't," he admitted. "But I couldn't stand by and let him get away with what he did to you. You deserved justice, Isaac, and I would have gone to the ends of the earth to make sure you got it." He paused, his eyes searching his brother's face. "This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about making sure he can't do it to anyone else." Isaac nodded slowly, a new sense of understanding dawning on him. "I never thought I'd see it happen. I thought people would just keep looking away, pretending it didn't matter." "People looked away because they were afraid," Nathan said, his tone somber. "Afraid to stand up, afraid to challenge the system. But they don't get to decide what you deserve. Only you do." Isaac took a shaky breath, the weight of Nathan's words settling on him. "It's hard to believe that it's over. That I don't have to look over my shoulder every time I'm out on the street, wondering if he's watching, waiting to remind me that I don't belong." Nathan shook his head, his voice firm. "You belong just as much as anyone else, Isaac. More, even. You've survived what most people couldn't even imagine. You've held on when others would have given up. That's something to be proud of." Isaac looked away, his gaze drifting to the horizon. I just want to feel normal again, you know. To walk down the street and not feel like people are judging me, like I'm invisible." Nathan's face softened, his voice gentle. "You're not invisible, Isaac. You never were. And anyone who made you feel that way, well, they were blind to your strength, to your worth. You have people who love you, who see you. And you don't need to carry their ignorance anymore." They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet of the night surrounding them like a blanket, wrapping them in its stillness. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and Isaac felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, as if the city itself were finally giving him a moment to breathe. Suddenly, Isaac turned to Nathan, his eyes shining with an emotion that was hard to decipher. "Nathan, thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with gratitude. "For everything. I don't know how to repay you." Nathan smiled, his expression warm and full of pride. "You don't owe me anything, Isaac. I did what any brother would do. I'd do it 100 times over if it meant you could find peace." Isaac looked down, swallowing hard. "I'm not used to people fighting for me," he murmured. "I'm used to being the one left behind, the one people pass by without a second glance." "Well," Nathan said, his tone soft but resolute, "not anymore. Not ever again. You're not alone, Isaac. Not as long as I'm around." Isaac took a deep breath, feeling the weight in his chest begin to lift. It was as if a door had opened, allowing in a light he hadn't seen in years. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a future for him beyond the pain and the struggle. They started walking, the city quiet around them, each step feeling like a small victory. Isaac felt his thoughts drift, wondering what he might do now, what life could look like without the constant threat of Grant's shadow looming over him. He turned to Nathan, a question forming on his lips. "What's next?" he asked, his voice tentative. "I mean, now that this is over." Nathan looked at him, a slight smile on his face. "That's up to you, Isaac. You've got a clean slate. You can go wherever you want, do whatever feels right. And I'll be there to support you, no matter what." Isaac nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Maybe I'll start looking for work again. Something small, nothing fancy. Just, something to get me back on my feet." "That sounds like a good start," Nathan agreed, his tone encouraging. "And if you need help, you know where to find me." They continued walking, each lost in their own thoughts, but the bond between them stronger than ever. For Isaac, the night felt different somehow, as if he were seeing the world through new eyes. The darkness didn't seem as oppressive, the cold not as biting. He felt a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that he was finally stepping out of the shadows. After a while, they reached Isaac's shelter, a small, modest building nestled among the tall skyscrapers that seemed to loom over it protectively. Nathan stopped, looking at the entrance with a thoughtful expression. "Are you sure you want to stay here?" he asked gently, his concern evident. "You know I can help you find a better place. Somewhere safer, more stable." Isaac smiled, a faint but genuine smile. "This place isn't much, but it's been home," he said quietly. "I don't want to take more than I need, Nathan. I appreciate everything you've done, but I want to rebuild my life on my own terms." Nathan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I get it. But just know that you don't have to do it all alone. You've got family, people who care about you." Isaac placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder, his grip firm. "I know. And that's more than I could have asked for." They stood there for a moment, two brothers bound by something far deeper than blood, a shared resilience, a commitment to one another that transcended the hardships they'd faced. As they said their goodbyes and Nathan turned to leave, Isaac watched him go, feeling a sense of gratitude that was hard to put into words. In that moment, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something new, something hopeful. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't defined by what he'd endured, he was defined by what he'd overcome, by the people who stood by him when the world had turned its back. And as he turned to walk inside, Isaac knew one thing with certainty: he was finally free. As Isaac walked back to the shelter, the silence of the night felt different, almost welcoming. For the first time in a long while, he felt lighter, as though a weight he'd carried for years had finally lifted. But as he settled in for the night, a series of thoughts began to surface, thoughts that he hadn't anticipated. He was finally free of Grant, of the fear and humiliation, but the victory felt complicated. The memories of what he'd been through didn't vanish simply because justice had been served. Over the next few days, Isaac began to see the fallout from Grant's downfall. News spread quickly. It was on the front page of every newspaper and became the talk of the city. People spoke in hushed tones about the officer who had been disgraced, the accusations of abuse, the revelations of his cruelty. Some were shocked, others disbelieving. And a few felt a sense of vindication, especially those who had been subjected to similar treatment but had never dared to speak up. Nathan, meanwhile, continued working behind the scenes, ensuring that the case against Grant was airtight. But even for him, there was a moral weight that lingered, a question he hadn't yet addressed. He had accomplished what he'd set out to do, but it wasn't as simple as he'd hoped. In bringing down Grant, he had also exposed the deep-seated flaws within the police department, an institution he had spent his life defending. He was proud of what he'd done for Isaac, yet there was an undercurrent of discomfort he couldn't quite shake. One evening, a few days after Grant's suspension, Nathan called Isaac, suggesting they meet up at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Isaac agreed, and as he entered, he saw his brother sitting at a corner booth, his face lined with exhaustion. Isaac slid into the seat across from him, offering a faint smile. "Rough week?" he asked gently. Nathan nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. "You could say that," he replied. "The city's been in an uproar. People are demanding answers, wondering how someone like Grant was allowed to stay on the force for so long." Isaac studied him, sensing the tension beneath his words. "Isn't that what we wanted?" he asked cautiously. "For people to see the truth?" "Yes," Nathan replied, his voice tight. "But it's complicated. It's opened up more than I anticipated. There are other officers, people I've worked with, who, well, they're starting to feel the pressure. They're wondering if they're next, if their actions will come under scrutiny." He hesitated, then added, "Some of them are good people, Isaac. People who don't deserve to be dragged down by Grant's mistakes." Isaac leaned back, considering his brother's words. "So you're saying, it's not just about him anymore?" Nathan's gaze shifted, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "That's the thing. Once the truth is out, it doesn't stop with one person. It spreads, and it affects everyone, whether they're guilty or not." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Justice is never clean, Isaac. It's messy. It impacts people in ways you don't expect, sometimes even the innocent." Isaac felt a pang of guilt, realizing that Nathan's actions, though motivated by a desire to protect him, had put his brother in an incredibly difficult position. "I didn't think about that," he murmured. "I was so focused on getting justice, I didn't realize the ripple effect it would have." Nathan's expression softened, and he reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Isaac's. "You don't need to carry that burden," he said gently. "What happened was wrong, and Grant needed to face the consequences. None of this is your fault." Isaac nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake than he'd realized. The victory had come at a cost, one that was now affecting not just him and Nathan, but countless others. He looked down, struggling with the weight of this realization. "Do you regret it?" Isaac asked quietly, glancing up at his brother. Nathan hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He looked down at his hands, his face thoughtful. "No," he said finally, his voice steady. "I don't regret standing up for you. I would do it all over again. But I do think about the aftermath. About the people who were affected by this, who are now questioning everything they thought they knew about the system." Isaac absorbed this, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He had never intended to cause such widespread upheaval, but he couldn't deny that the exposure of the truth had brought about a sense of validation he had longed for. Yet, he also saw the toll it was taking on Nathan, on the very system his brother had devoted his life to. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts. Finally, Nathan spoke, his voice low. "People are starting to look at me differently, Isaac. Some see me as a hero, someone who stood up for what's right. But others, they see me as a traitor, someone who turned his back on his own. Isaac's heart ached at the pain in his brother's voice. "You're not a traitor," he said firmly. "You did what you had to do, for me, for others who didn't have a voice. That doesn't make you the enemy." Nathan nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I know that, in theory. But it's different when you're faced with the reality of it, when people you respect start questioning your loyalty, start wondering if you'll expose them too." He sighed, leaning back. "It's hard to see people you thought were friends look at you with suspicion." Isaac was silent, his mind racing. He had never considered the personal cost to Nathan, the way this fight for justice would affect his brother's life, his career. It wasn't just a single victory over Grant, it was a battle that had shaken an entire system, challenging beliefs and loyalties that had long gone unquestioned. After a moment, Isaac reached across the table, placing his hand over Nathan's. "Nathan," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you. I know this isn't easy, and I can't imagine the pressure you're under. But I need you to know that what you did, it mattered. It mattered more than you can ever know." Nathan met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "That's what keeps me going, Isaac. Knowing that, in the end, it was worth it. That someone was finally able to stand up, to say, no more. That makes all the difference." They stayed there, sharing a quiet understanding, a bond that had been forged through hardship and resilience. Nathan knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, that there would be consequences he couldn't yet foresee. But in that moment, sitting across from his brother, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. As they prepared to leave the diner, Nathan's phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he read it. Isaac noticed the change in his expression and felt a surge of concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. Nathan looked up, his face unreadable. "It's from a colleague," he said slowly. Apparently, there's a protest happening outside the precinct. People are demanding that the police address the accusations against Grant, that they take responsibility for what he did." Isaac felt a chill run down his spine. "A protest?" Nathan nodded, his face tense. "Yeah. Looks like this has sparked something bigger than we thought. People are angry, and they want answers." Isaac's mind raced, the implications of this revelation settling over him like a heavy weight. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something much larger, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. The people were demanding change, demanding accountability, and it was a force that neither he nor Nathan had anticipated. They left the diner, the cool night air hitting them once again as they stepped outside. Nathan glanced at his phone, reading updates on the protest as they walked. The crowd was growing, their voices rising, echoing through the streets as they called for justice, for an end to the abuses that had been ignored for too long. As they approached the precinct, they could see the glow of flashlights, the silhouettes of people holding signs, their voices carrying a sense of urgency and frustration. Nathan and Isaac stopped at a distance, watching as the crowd continued to gather, their chants filling the air. Isaac felt a surge of mixed emotions, pride, fear, hope, all intertwining within him. This was more than he had ever imagined, a wave of collective pain and resilience that had finally found its voice. He looked at Nathan, seeing the same emotions reflected in his brother's eyes. This is bigger than us, isn't it?" Isaac murmured, his voice barely audible. Nathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "Yes," he said softly. "It's bigger than you, than me, than any one person. It's about all the people who've been ignored, all the voices that have been silenced." He took a deep breath, the gravity of the moment settling over him. "We're witnessing something that could change things, Isaac. And that's powerful." They stood together, side by side, as the crowd continued to grow, their voices rising in a unified call for justice. In that moment, Isaac realized that he was no longer alone in his struggle. He was part of something greater, a movement that was pushing for change, for a world where no one had to live in fear or shame. Nathan placed a hand on Isaac's shoulder, a silent promise, a reminder that he would always be there, that they would face whatever came next together. And as the chants filled the night air, Isaac felt a profound sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the world was finally ready to listen. The aftermath of the protest settled over the city like the quiet after a storm. In the days that followed, things changed in ways neither Isaac nor Nathan had expected. The department announced that it would conduct a thorough investigation into Grant's conduct and review every complaint filed against him and others who had, until now, gone unchecked. The local press picked up the story, amplifying it further, bringing the discussion of accountability and justice to nearly every corner of the city. Isaac felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The fear he'd once carried around with him was now a memory, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. He knew this was just the beginning, there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt that he had reclaimed his voice, his dignity. He had faced his demons, confronted the shadows of his past, and come out stronger on the other side. Nathan, meanwhile, found himself the subject of praise and scrutiny alike. Some hailed him as a hero, a man brave enough to challenge the very institution he was a part of. Others, however, viewed him as a traitor, someone who had betrayed his own. But Nathan remained steadfast, unshaken by either the praise or criticism. He knew he had done the right thing, and that conviction was enough to ground him amidst the swirling opinions. One morning, about a month after the protest, Isaac received a call. It was from a non-profit organization that had heard his story. They offered him a job, a chance to help others who, like him, had fallen through the cracks, struggling with homelessness and poverty. Isaac was stunned, momentarily speechless, but the sense of purpose that washed over him was undeniable. This was his opportunity to give back, to use his own experiences to help others find hope in what had once seemed a hopeless world. When he shared the news with Nathan over coffee later that day, Nathan's face broke into a smile that reached his eyes, a rare look of true pride and joy. "Isaac, that's incredible," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "I can't think of anyone better for this. You understand what they're going through, you know the struggle firsthand. You'll be able to reach people in a way no one else can." Isaac chuckled, the weight of his past struggles now a source of strength. "I never thought I'd end up here," he admitted, his voice soft. "But maybe everything that happened, maybe it was leading me to this." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the hardest battles bring us to the places we're meant to be," he replied. "You've been through more than most people could handle, and you came out stronger. I think you're exactly where you're meant to be." As the weeks turned into months, Isaac embraced his new role with passion and dedication. He poured himself into the work, spending his days speaking with those who had lost hope, offering not only resources but empathy and understanding. Every story he heard reminded him of his own journey, and he became a beacon of resilience for those around him. His past, once a source of shame, was now a badge of honor, a testament to his strength and perseverance. Meanwhile, Nathan continued his work in law enforcement, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He became known within his department as someone who wouldn't turn a blind eye, someone who valued integrity over loyalty to the status quo. Colleagues and superiors alike knew that Nathan was committed to justice in its truest form, and his actions inspired others to question, to hold themselves accountable, to strive for something better. One evening, months after the confrontation with Grant, Isaac was invited to speak at a community event. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: police officers, community leaders, activists, and individuals struggling with homelessness. As he took the stage, Isaac felt a surge of emotion. This was his moment to share his story, to speak his truth not as a victim, but as a survivor, a fighter. He began to speak, his voice steady but filled with conviction. He talked about the pain, the humiliation, the sense of invisibility he'd once felt. But he also spoke of resilience, of the power of standing up for oneself, of the importance of hope even in the darkest moments. He shared how, with the support of his brother and others who believed in him, he had reclaimed his life, turning his story into one of triumph rather than defeat. The audience listened in rapt silence, many moved to tears by the raw honesty in his words. Isaac's journey resonated with them, a testament to the power of redemption, of rising above adversity. By the time he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that filled the space with an overwhelming sense of solidarity and respect. After the event, Nathan approached him, his eyes bright with pride. "You did it, Isaac. You took everything they tried to take from you, and you turned it into something powerful, something they can never touch." Isaac smiled, his gaze steady. "I finally understand, Nathan. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about healing, about giving people the strength to move forward. That's what you gave me, the chance to heal." Nathan nodded, understanding the depth of his brother's words. "And now you're giving that same chance to others. I couldn't be prouder of you." In the months that followed, the city began to change, slowly but surely. The protest had sparked a movement, a call for reform within the police department, a demand for accountability and transparency. Policies were put in place to ensure that officers like Grant could no longer operate without consequence, that complaints from the public would be taken seriously, investigated thoroughly. As for Grant, he faced his own reckoning. Stripped of his badge, he had become a pariah, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. He had been a man who thrived on power, who believed himself untouchable. But now, he lived a life of isolation, shunned by the community he had once controlled with an iron fist. Justice, in the end, had been served. Isaac and Nathan continued to walk their paths, side by side but distinct, each one finding fulfillment in their own way. Isaac's life had transformed from one of survival to one of purpose, his journey a beacon of hope for those around him. Nathan, too, had changed. He was more than just a law enforcement officer, he had become a force for true justice, someone unafraid to challenge the systems that no longer served the people. Their bond, tested and strengthened by adversity, remained unbreakable. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had emerged into the light, stronger and more resilient than ever. This story isn't just about justice for Isaac, it's about resilience, about finding strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Isaac's journey from despair to hope, from silence to speaking his truth, is a reminder that no one should be forced to endure suffering in silence. The people around us, the ones we sometimes pass by without a second thought, each have their own struggles, their own stories. And sometimes, they just need someone to see them, to believe in them, to stand by their side when no one else will. In the end, true justice isn't just about holding the guilty accountable, it's about restoring dignity, giving people the power to reclaim their lives. It's about creating a world where everyone is valued, where no one is invisible. So, what did this story mean to you? Do you believe that justice can truly heal, or does the cost sometimes feel too great? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. Your perspective is a vital part of this story's impact. And if you enjoyed this journey with us, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power within each of us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.